There's evidence, if you examine the diagnostic manuals that psychiatrists in the U.S. have been using for the last 60 to 70 years, what you find is that the first edition was about that thick, and then the second edition got bigger, the third edition got bigger, and then the fourth and the fifth kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And what was happening was that there were an increasing number of, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, but others' opinion too, an increasing number of ordinary problems in living that were becoming categorized as diagnosable mental disorders.
Welcome to the Become Your Own Therapist podcast, the podcast where I try to put myself out of a job as a clinical psychologist. Today we have, for the first time, a guest who is on the podcast twice. We have Professor James E. Maddux, who is a university professor emeritus in the Department of Psychology and senior scholar at the Center for the Advancement of Wellbeing at George Mason University. He's the former editor of the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology and former director of the Clinical Psychology Doctoral Program at George Mason University. He's the co-editor of Social Psychological Foundations of Clinical Psychology, co-editor of Psychopathology, subtitle being The Foundations for Contemporary Understanding, and editor of Subjective Wellbeing and Life Satisfaction. Maddux is a fellow of American Psychological Association's divisions of General, Clinical, and Health Psychology, and a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. His recent activities have included international travel that has involved giving lectures, teaching graduate students, and organizing workshops on evidence-based clinical interventions, primarily in the former communist bloc countries of Eastern Europe. But today he is just on Zoom with us. Okay, great to have you back, Jim.
It's nice to be here. The last time I was here, I had a lot of fun. It was very interesting. I hope the audience that got a chance to view it found something interesting, and I'm happy to be back, especially since, as I mentioned to you previously, when you mentioned my travels, after the pandemic hit, I was not traveling, have not been outside of the country for over 2.5 years, and have missed the international side of my job, of my profession. And so it's great to be able to use Zoom to zoom into South Africa and without having to hop on a plane and wear a mask for 16 hours. So this is a nice way of substituting international travel for the time being. I'm hoping that when the world returns to somewhat normal, I can get on a flight without having to wear a mask, but that remains to be seen. In the meantime, this is convenient and fun, so I'm happy to be here again.
Yeah, I love that. Zooming into South Africa. Great. So yeah, for those listening today, we're going to be talking about quite a big concept, which is what is a mental disorder? What are these categories that we use? How did they come about? How do we understand them? What are the different ways to understand what a mental disorder is? What are the alternatives to this? What are the pros and cons? So just a big general discussion about psychiatric mental disorders and the categories that we have, so that you can be empowered in your own understanding of how we come about categorizing people. Okay, great. So, there are many avenues into this topic, I think. So I think I'd like to check in with you, Jim, about maybe just getting some ground terms clarified here. So, and maybe going in with why you think it's important to speak about what a mental disorder is.
I think that's a great place to start. I love what you said a minute ago about our understanding is empowerment. And I think that that's true in life in general. The more you understand something, the more empowered you are, the more power you have to make changes, whether it's in your own life or in society. And I also, along the same lines, I believe that understanding the concept of mental disorder, understanding the concept of psychological problems, understanding what those terms mean, understanding alternatives to those terms and alternative concepts can help people who are experiencing psychological problems, and we all do from time to time, including everyday problems in living. But I think understanding those concepts helps you understand yourself. And the better you understand yourself and the problems you're experiencing, I think the more power you have to deal with them constructively. So even though this is going to be, in some ways, a broad and wide-ranging philosophical, scientific discussion that usually takes place in professional conferences among psychologists, psychiatrists. I'm hoping that you and I can make this a practical discussion and discuss some reasons why understanding these notions is important and can be useful for people.
Okay, great. Yeah, I love that. And I think maybe a useful distinction to make here is the common standards of practice and how clinicians practice, what they use to come up to diagnose someone, and then maybe from there shifting into maybe some alternative understandings of human psychology, and from there moving into maybe the controversies with the current psychiatric system. So if we just start with, what are the common standards of practice for those listening? How does one get diagnosed with a mental disorder?
Well, you and I touched on this last time when we had a brief discussion. It may have been after the video was over. I can't recall when we had this discussion about your own training as a clinical psychologist and my training as a clinical psychologist, and how our training was very traditional in that in most clinical PhD programs or even master's programs, and in most medical schools, in most medical school courses on psychiatry, they follow what is usually called the disease model of psychological problems, meaning psychological problems are diseases or like diseases that exist inside of people and that the person has little control over, in the same way that you have little control over whether you have, once you have cancer, you have little control over what happens inside your body. Once you have leukemia, or once you have COVID, you have little control personally over the course of that disease. And so, traditionally, psychological problems or mental disorders have been viewed from the same lens of seeing them as conditions that exist inside of people that cause people to behave in certain ways, and that even explain why a person is behaving in a certain way. For example, if a person has been experiencing for several weeks or months profound sadness, loss of interest in activities, changes in appetite, loss of interest in sexual activities, loss of interest in anything the person found pleasurable, maybe even thoughts of suicide, the person may be diagnosed as having a major depressive disorder. And some people might view that term as identifying something inside the person that is causing the person to behave in the ways that I just described. But another way of viewing it is that term simply is a shorthand description for what the person is experiencing and doesn't explain anything. So the problems with these labels, one of the problems is that many people see them as identifying something inside the person that explains why the person is behaving the way, is feeling the way the person is feeling, or behaving the way the person is behaving. So that essentially is the disease model. In fact, the the diagnostic category systems, the DSM, which is used mainly, I believe, now in the United States, which refers to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And then there is the ICD, which is used in most of the rest of the world, International Classification of Diseases. Those two diagnostic schemes basically use the disease model and separate psychological problems into what appear to be nice, neat, discrete categories in the way that we separate physical disease entities into categories and give them names. And when someone has a medical or biological disease, there is something inside the person that has gone wrong. And that thing that has gone wrong typically is an explanation for the symptoms the person is experiencing. And usually, more often than not, identifying the thing inside the person that has gone wrong biologically also suggests ways of treating that condition and or improving that condition. That is less the case with psychological problems because there's nothing inside the person's body, at least in most cases, that has gone wrong to explain why the person is experiencing these problems with depression or anxiety or other kinds of issues. So that's the traditional disease model that I was trained in, that you were trained in, and that probably the majority of mental health professionals in the world today were trained in. And many people, I think the vast majority of the public, probably, the disease model also is publicized or propagated in the media, in movies and television shows where they take a traditional disease model, medical model view when describing people who have psychological problems. So my guess is the vast majority of the public also takes a disease model of psychological problems. I think what that does, there's so many things that I think are misleading about that model. But one of the main things that I think is misleading about it is that it suggests to people that once they have a psychological problem, once they have a formal diagnosis, that there's not a lot that the person can do about it himself or herself without the assistance of a professional person whose job it is to cure you of the disease. So I think it takes power away from people and puts the understanding and puts the power in the hands of somebody else instead of in your own hands and I think the word empowering is probably a good term here. I think that the disease model in some ways is disempowering, and that viewing it from other perspectives can be more empowering and can encourage people in the belief that I can do something about what I am experiencing. Mm-hmm. That no one needs to fix me. There's nothing broken inside of me that needs to be fixed, even though sometimes change is difficult and sometimes professional assistance in change is helpful. But I think that people can make significant changes on their own if they have an understanding of the true causes of psychological problems that exist outside of this disease model. Mm-hmm. That was a lot of information. Maybe we should break that down, or maybe you can help me break it down somewhat.
It's a big topic.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll definitely help pass some of that. So
okay, great.
I imagine that a big message in this is that we've inherited the disease model in psychology from medical practitioners. Mm-hmm. And then we've tried to understand mental and human suffering in terms of disease entities, just as the medical professionals have done. And that's had that's had some effect in helping people, but we're starting to see many problems with that. One being that many psychological problems, the root cause of it isn't necessarily just rooted inside your skull or in your biology, but that there are lots of what you term true causes, true influences in terms of how how I want to say human suffering comes about.
That was a very succinct summary of my rambling discussion. So I think that really summarizes it nicely. Yes.
Okay, great.
And while we're talking about true causes, an alternative to seeing psychological problems as literally existing inside of people is to view psychological problems as embedded in a network of relationships, other people, family, friends, loved ones, society, your culture, your status in society, where you are in your culture in terms of minority, majority, racial, ethnicity status, where you are in your culture in terms of class, income, education, social, educational status. Those are all the bigger factors in which psychological problems are embedded. Just to give you an example from research in the United States, this is probably true in many other countries. We do know, for example, that people who live in poor sections of big cities in the United States, those people are largely racial minorities, typically grow up in very stressful environments where crime is high, where people are struggling day to day, month to month, week to week to make ends meet. People hold down various jobs. There are many of these areas are unsafe. And so the people are living under very stressful conditions. So it should come to no surprise that people who are living under those conditions for long periods of time are going to experience are going to have a higher incidence of emotional psychological problems than people living in an affluent white suburb in the United States, where the schools are good, where people aren't struggling month to month to make ends meet, where crime is very low. We can look at Washington, D.C., for example, where as you move from the northwestern part of the city to the southeastern, the composition of the population becomes more racially mixed. If you go to the Northwest, it's almost entirely white, and it's wealthy. People have big homes and big yards and good schools, or they send their kids to private schools. As you move across the city, including the neighborhood where I used to live, Capitol Hill, that the neighborhoods become poorer and more crime-ridden. And so those are more stressful places to live. So it's impossible to understand, it would be impossible to understand the psychological issues being brought to a mental health professional by a young African-American single mother with children in the poorest section of Washington, D.C., without understanding the conditions under which she has been living for years and years. So psychological problems and understanding her relationships with other people, family, friends, the father of her children, for example. So all of those social and cultural factors are essential to understanding a psychological problem. Those things don't exist inside the person. They exist in the situation the person finds himself or finds herself in. So that's what I mean by looking at the true causes, and maybe true is probably a bad word because causes aren't true or untrue, but understanding the broader causes, all the factors that go into a particular expression of psychological problems by a particular person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what would you say to someone who says, hold on, checked on Google, and Google told me that I feel depressed because I've just got, I'm lacking some serotonin in my brain.
There is some evidence, of course, that there's an interaction between emotional states and what is happening in the brain, the nervous system. And we know, of course, that medications can be useful in dealing with some psychological problems, particularly chronic and severe ones. But the evidence that a change in serotonin is causing the person to be depressed, that evidence is lacking. We know there's a back and forth relationship, but we also know, and this to me is very interesting. So a person assumes that my depression is a result of a serotonin disorder in my brain. And if I can just correct that serotonin disorder in my brain, that the fact that I am living in poverty and I have a single mother with 3 children struggling, that doesn't matter at all because we just fixed my serotonin. That's not going to work. That simply giving the single mother living in poverty in southeastern Washington, D.C., that is not going to fix the situation that she finds herself. That situation still exists. There's also a lot of evidence that particularly with antidepressant medications, that the majority of the effect of those medications is placebo, meaning it's an expectation that the psychiatrist gives me a pill and tells me that in a few weeks you're going to feel better. Because I expect to feel better, then I start feeling better because the psychiatrist has given me some hope that this is going to work. So there's not really good evidence that the depression, that the depressive experience, that the emotional problems being experienced by the single mother living in poverty and in a crime-ridden neighborhood in Washington, D.C. There's very little evidence that she's suffering from a serotonin disorder. She's suffering from a social disorder, from a condition that is dysfunctional. So those simple explanations to me just don't hold up based on the research on those medications, and they don't hold up when you try to understand the broader context in which a person finds himself or herself. Yeah, we know, for example, that unemployment results in greater experiences of depression in a culture or society. Now, there's no evidence that being unemployed causes serotonin levels to change in your system. I mean, those explanations, even though they're simple and maybe gratifying in some ways, they simply don't provide an explanation that can lead to more effective ways of dealing with those problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this reminds me of when I worked at a child and family unit during my internship, and what we noticed was that the children who came to us and were depressed, and we gave them an antidepressant and sent them back to the same family system, that medication hardly ever had any purchase on their experience. Whereas we did family therapy. Yeah. And then we had many cases where we did family therapy and we shifted the system, the social setting. And that had a tremendous impact, even without addressing anything within the child or within their biology.
Yeah, because that problem exists in a family system. That family exists lives in a neighborhood. That neighborhood could be wealthy or poor or middle class, and even dealing with if that family, for example, came from a poor and dangerous neighborhood in Washington, D.C. or in Johannesburg, and you did family therapy and then stuck that family back to where they're going, then my guess is that whatever changes took place are going to be short-lived, because that family those parents are still going to be overwhelmed by the unsafe, unstable conditions that they are living in. So we're talking about a system that goes beyond simply a couple or a family. It extends to a culture and to a social network and social structure.
Something that struck me as you were speaking was why, or not why, how can someone profit from saying that your suffering is caused by the network that you're in? I was thinking it's a lot easier for medical professionals or therapists to profit from saying there's a serotonin deficiency and here's a pill. So there's like economic incentive there. And I wondered if that's why the social aspect is maybe de-emphasized, because it's not directly rooted to a product that's being sold, or
So
I don't know.
when you say profit, you literally mean profit. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. That's a great question. That gets at the issue. Oh my gosh, economic issues, political issues, ideological issues. I mean, for example, it can be argued. So there's evidence if you examine the diagnostic manuals that psychiatrists in the U.S. have been using for the last 60 to 70 years. What you find is that the first edition was about that thick, and then the second edition got bigger, the third edition got bigger, and then the fourth and the fifth kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And what was happening was that there were an increasing number of, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, but others' opinion too, an increasing number of ordinary problems in living that were becoming categorized as diagnosable mental disorders. And the individual disorders were becoming redefined so broadly that they were including more and more of what I would call ordinary problems in living. There's now, for example, a disorder in the fifth edition of this manual, this diagnostic manual, and I've forgotten the exact term, but I think it's called extended grief disorder or something like that. So if you've lost a loved one, a spouse, a sibling, a child, and you are grieving, I've forgotten what the exact criteria, but if you are grieving longer than they think you should be grieving, then you have a diagnosable psychiatric disorder, as opposed to you have had a traumatic life experience that anyone would have some negative emotional reaction to. So if you look at at these manuals, they've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. More and more problems in living are diagnosed as psychiatric disorders, and the disorders themselves have become broader and broader. Now let's bring in the issue of profit. When it's a benefit economically and financially to mental health professionals like yourself, for more and more people to believe that they have a psychological disorder that requires the help of a mental health professional. That's good for business. It's also good for the business of the pharmaceutical companies, for more and more people to believe that I have a psychological disorder, a psychiatric disease that can be fixed by a new medication being offered by the pharmaceutical companies. So profit, I hate to be cynical about these things, but I think in any human activity, economic factors come into play. And so there is, I think, some motivation on the part of the pharmaceutical companies to encourage mental health professionals to expand the boundaries of so-called mental disorders and to encourage people in the public to believe that they have a disorder that can be fixed by taking a drug, a medication.
Yeah, I have the same view of these things, and I'd like to hear from you. What do you think is the problem here? Do you think the problem is the rapid expansion of mental disorders to the point where everything, even I love that phrase you use, ordinary. I think you said ordinary challenges of living.
Problems in living, ordinary problems in living.
Ordin- yeah, ordinary problems in living. Do you think the problem is that, too much is being pathologized or made to seem, unnormal? Or do you think the problem is that even more fundamental than that, that we have to almost dial it way back, even before this stuff has expanded, and ask, wait, what is a mental disorder? Are mental disorders real? Is there, something called depression that's in you? Like, is it? Yeah.
That's a good question, a big question, and I think, again, what has been happening, again, and the evidence is in these diagnostic manuals and the detail and the size of them, that the definition of psychological disorder, mental disorder, has broadened over the decade to include experiences that previously would be seen as, well, that's just part of life. You get blue sometimes, or you're nervous about these things, which is not to say that interventions for those problems shouldn't be used or employed, but I think it's a mistake to encourage people to believe that life is a series of mental disorders, one after the other, that need to be treated either with psychotherapy or psychotherapy and medication. Of course, the cheapest, quickest way to deal with any psychological medical problem is to give a person a pill. And, it requires, 15 minutes to diagnose someone, and then you write a prescription out and the person's on their way, and they expect to get better, and they might temporarily, but it's fast, efficient, and cheap. Psychotherapy is hard work on the part of the client and on the part of the mental health professional. It takes time. It's probably in most cases more expensive than giving someone a pill, but it's difficult. It takes work, and a lot of people are encouraged to believe that the pill will fix them. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, or sometimes the fix is temporary, because so much of the fix is the person's belief that the pill is the fix, as opposed to, I need to work hard to change my life, or society needs to do something about that poor, impoverished, crime-ridden neighborhood that I find myself in.
Yeah.
Which goes back to the idea that psychological problems exist in networks of people, networks of neighborhoods, networks of social norms, networks of political networks, economic networks. It's all, these things are all interconnected.
How do you see mental what we traditionally term mental disorders then? If we say that not everything is a disease inside of you, not everything is just something gone wrong with your neurochemistry or your biology in some way. If that can be disempowering, the disease model, if that can be disempowering, what is an empowering way to see these problems that people struggle with? You've already mentioned the systems aspect of it, but then. I think it's quite a broad question, but what is a mental disorder then? If
the term mental disorder is not a term that I would even use, because the term itself is derived from the disease model. Again, it suggests that there's a condition that I have that has a name and has a cause, and the cause inside of me needs to be addressed before I can start to feel better and behave differently. There is been a lot of research on what is referred to as a network analysis approach. And it really is what I was talking about earlier, about seeing psychological problems, looking at, and again, psychological problems I prefer to think of them as patterns, patterns of thinking, patterns of feeling, patterns of behaving, and as you know as well as I do, that we're talking about a cognitive behavioral model of looking at psychological problems, as they are patterns in the way I think, patterns in the way I feel, patterns in the way I behave, and the way I think and the way I feel and the way I behave are interconnected. Each one influences the other. And looking for the one place where it started probably is a dead-end search. The answer is in understanding how those three components fit together, how they influence each other. And that and the advantage there is that if you see these various parts fitting together as a system, you can change the system by changing any of those parts. Instead of having to find the cause, because there is no the cause. There are things that are affecting each other. A good example of this is let's take a problem with anxiety. That people who are experiencing what is sometimes called an anxiety disorder, experiencing a lot of anxiety or fear when thinking about a particular situation or thing. It could be a child who's afraid of dogs, an adult who's afraid of snakes, or a person who is terrified of public speaking, or a person with extreme social anxiety who is terrified of entering any new social situation. When a person, and what that person is doing, what influences that feeling of fear is a set of beliefs about that situation. Dogs are unsafe. Snakes are dangerous. If I give a speech in front of a crowd, they're going to think I'm stupid and they're going to laugh at me. Or even if they're not laughing, they're making fun of me inside their own heads. And I'm going to make a mistake and make a fool of myself. If I go to this party or I've been invited out, on a date with someone, I'm so worried that I am going to say the wrong thing, not know what to say, spill my glass of wine, say something stupid. And so I get myself so worked up and so anxious that I'm motivated to avoid. I say, I just can't, these bad things might happen. I can't deal with them. I don't know how to deal with them. Therefore, I'm feeling so nervous. I'm just going to cancel the whole event, cancel the date, not go to the party, drop out of the class where I have to give a speech in front of the class. And as soon as I do that, I feel better. As soon as I decide that I'm going to avoid, my anxiety is lowered. And if I am successful in avoiding, then my anxiety is temporarily reduced. But then what happens? Then I start to berate myself for being fearful and for avoiding. I berate myself for, once again, not facing a fear that I, for years, have been wanting to deal with and face more effectively. So I become self-critical. And over time, my desire to avoid these situations becomes even stronger. And so I fail to learn what I need to learn to get over the problem. So the avoidance not only doesn't solve the problem, but the avoidance over time makes the problem worse. So we have this interacting system of fears about what might happen, beliefs about my inability to cope with these things should they happen, the anxiety which arises from thinking about those thoughts and dwelling on them and becoming obsessive about them. The anxiety leads to the avoidance. The avoidance leads to a temporary decrease in anxiety, which feels good, which then reinforces me for deciding to avoid and for avoiding. And over time, the problem doesn't get better. And even if you give me a pill to reduce my anxiety, those other problems, those other thoughts and beliefs don't automatically go away.
Mm-hmm.
We have a system. And the difference is the diagnostic manuals use psychological problems as a list of things, a list of thoughts and feelings and behaviors you need to experience for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 out of 10 of these for 2 weeks or for a month or so. Whereas the network analysis sees a system of interacting parts that that continually influence each other. And the advantage there, as I said before, is it tells you where you might intervene to change the system. For example, it is possible to give someone an anti-anxiety medication that has a short-term effect, and when that person is ready to go on the job interview, the person pops the pill and reduces the person's anxiety for an hour or two, enough to get through the interview. Now, that could be effective over time if the person uses that as an opportunity to realize that the bad things that I expected to happen in the job interview didn't happen, and the few things that threw me off, an unexpected question, I was able to deal with. So it could be a start to changing that system, but much more is needed to change that system on a more enduring basis than just taking a pill each time you feel nervous about something, because you don't learn anything about how to cope with it more effectively.
Yeah, the elegance and the utility of this way of thinking is so evident to me, because suddenly it's not just some disease that you have inside you. You have the disease of anxiety in you, but suddenly you've mapped this out into all these little nodes, all these little points of contact that you can make with, like the avoidance piece, so addressing the avoidance there, or maybe addressing the belief about I fear dogs. Suddenly you have so much more flexibility in what door.
Much more to work with. And I think the practical value of this is, so we talked a little earlier about cognitive behavioral therapy, and how cognitive behavioral therapy is a system for understanding all these interacting parts. What you were thinking, what you were feeling, how you were behaving, in what situations are you thinking and feeling and behaving in certain ways that you believe are not working well for you. Not working well means not getting you what you want. You're not accomplishing your goals in life, either in this situation or in life in general. So the cognitive behavioral therapist tries to identify all of those interacting pieces. And I think the practical value of this for a person who's considering psychotherapy is to look for someone who approaches psychological problems from this network analysis, someone who understands that whatever problem you're experiencing is embedded in your life, in your relationships, in your family, in your social network, in the neighborhood you are in the job you are in your coworkers. These are all the parts of your life are integrated and affecting each other. And that's what I would want someone to look for when they are looking for an effective psychotherapist, which is probably, my guess is that's the way you approach working with your clients.
Yeah, definitely. I use this network analysis. I've got this really cool software actually that helps you map out the nodes and the links.
Oh, that's great.
Directionality. Yeah, it's called.
I would share that with the client. Say, here, look at the screen here, because that's the understanding and the empowering. It's not just your secret. It's something you want them to understand, as well as you understand it.
Absolutely. It's actually a thought I've had. I haven't done it yet, but that's something I've been thinking about is, man, if they can get their, hands on this network, they can, take that into their own lives. And I guess even people who aren't in therapy, to be able to conceptualize themselves as a network.
Absolutely. Yeah, I am part of the network of people, of relationships, of culture, of society, and all those things affect me. And usually I'm not aware of how much they affect me until I stop and think about what's happening today that is resulting in this weird mood I'm in. Is it, that I have a fight with my partner, or things not going well at work? So it's a stop and think moment to help people understand. What I used to do when I was supervising clinical students is I would have them sit down with the client and on a piece of paper, write down the various pieces of the problem, and then together they would draw lines to what was affecting what. And so the client left with a copy of this, and the client had this picture to look at to try to understand the various ways in which, and in particular, the various ways in which the person's own behavior and the person's own attempt at resolving the problems not only wasn't resolving the problem, but making the problem worse. And people come to psychotherapy because their attempts at solving problems aren't working. And in most cases, their attempts at solving problems are actually making the problem worse instead of better. So this network approach, or seeing the various connections, particularly with the person at the center, says, here's how I am behaving that I think will make the problem better, but actually this seems to be making the problem worse. When my partner says this and I automatically get defensive and critical, then that's not helping. That's making things worse. So I need to find a better way of responding to that person's comments. Better meaning a better solution to that temporary problem. And particularly, I need to stop doing what seems to be making the problem worse. And sometimes that's enough. Just stop doing what's making things worse.
These two things coupled with each other. Firstly, formulating yourself as a network, and then also asking, how's this working for me? Is this making things better or worse? This sort of the processes that are playing out in this network. That, that 1-2 punch almost makes the traditional diagnostic categories a bit obsolete, almost like they dissolve away.
Right. You don't need them because you have the parts of the problem. And it can be a lot of work to do that, to understand, but it's possible, particularly with the right software program. Maybe people could just plug in their own issues and get a sense from the software of, that's connected to that. I never thought about that before.
Yeah. For those listening, you go to draw.io and you'll find it's free software.
I'm going to write this down. Draw.io.
Yes. So I'd highly recommend that. I learned about this through process-based therapy, which is a kind of therapy that uses network analysis to help you understand the client.
You've just given people one more way to stop seeing psychotherapists by giving them the software or the link to it.
Yeah. I wish I had these tools before I, became a therapist. Before I knew any of this, I wish I knew this stuff because it seems so valuable, and it appears to me so non-intuitive to think about your mental struggles as being caused by multiple influences. Because, I listen to the way people speak, even on a daily basis, and it seems like we're always looking for that silver bullet. We're always looking for that, I'm depressed because insert a unidimensional explanation there. I'm depressed because of what happened in childhood, or I am depressed because I'm unemployed, or just one thing. It's so non-intuitive to think that many little streams are trickling down into this big dam.
Well, I think the human brain looks for simple solutions. And I think the human brain, particularly so the world is complicated and messy. And the human brain struggles for ways of making the world simpler and more understandable. One way of doing that is assuming that everything has one cause, because then you identify the one cause and you've got the solution, as opposed to, well, there's lots of things happening here that in my life that could be the reason why I'm experiencing so much anger these days. So I think that the human brain also, I think, likes categories, because categories make the world simpler. If we can divide people into categories of race and ethnicity and social class and all those things, then we can identify we, us, and then you, them. And so instead of trying to understand the various complicated ways in which people of different cultures and backgrounds and skin tones and everything else interact and how they influence each other, if I can just put people in nice, neat categories, now I know which people to avoid. That I can make decisions about life based on those simple categories, because life is otherwise too complicated to try to make sense. And the same thing is true, I think, of putting human emotional problems into categories. It helps us feel like we understand, but to me, it's simply an illusion of understanding that makes us feel like we have the world under better control. But actually, to me, the search for categories gets in the way of the kind of understanding that we were talking about, which is understanding how all these influences, including what is happening inside the body. We can't leave that out, because we know that things are happening in the body. Emotions are bodily experiences. But understanding that complex network, that's the true understanding of something.
Yeah.
Somebody once said that you never really understand. The best way to understand a system is to try to change it. And one of the best ways of trying to understand yourself is to try to change something about yourself that is not working for you. And then you begin to see how it influences everybody else in your life.
Yeah.
And some people resist the change, some people encourage the change. But you are embedded in a system.
There is, actually, before I comment on that, I see that we are on the hour. Is it okay if we go a bit over time?
Well, yes. Although Alexa is telling me that I need to call my mother.
Oh, okay.
We can run over.
Okay, great. 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Are you okay with that?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Great.
You can edit out Alexa.
No, that's okay. I'll leave a little imperfect moment.
Yeah.
I think what I wanted to comment there is that, you put it so well, how this oversimplification of what's going on with us can sometimes be counterproductive, and we need a way. We need a way to understand ourselves that dignifies the complexity of human struggles. And
dignifies is a great word. Yes.
And I think network analysis and understanding ourselves through that sort of method allows for a dignification of that complexity because of the multiple influences. I was thinking about how I have personally, used what you just described now, which is the best way to understand the system is to try to influence it, is to try to shift it, because I've noticed that in my own personal life, I've had the tendency, and I've seen this in some of my clients as well, the tendency to want to have to understand ourselves perfectly before acting in the world, or before doing something. And what you're describing sounds a bit more like, you a bit more like a scientist almost. Like you experiment first, you behave,
absolutely,
and then you run the experiment, and then you get the data, and then,
and then you say, well, that didn't work out quite as well as I was expecting. So what can I do differently next time in this same situation to maybe for things to work out more the way I want them to, understanding that there is no perfect solution to these problems, but there are ways of making things better. And if a person is striving to eliminate from their lives sadness, anxiety, anger, frustration, then you are, that's a dead end because you can't eliminate those things. That's part of being a human being, but you can learn to minimize them, control them, understand them, learn from them, but you'll never get rid of them.
Yeah.
And once you understand that, once you understand that you can't get rid of these feelings and problems, meaning get rid of for all time, then you set reasonable goals for yourself. And when you set reasonable goals, you're more likely to experience some success and to feel better about it. And a lot of this is just accepting the fact that life is messy and life is imperfect, which is hard to do when life is going very, very imperfectly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such useful advice in terms of the setting reasonable goals and understanding that these things aren't totally going to go away. Because I've seen people who have tried to help themselves, but they try to help themselves in such a drastic way that every time it doesn't work out, it just adds a bit of hopelessness about the situation because the goal was too lofty.
And it could be that the person's attempted strategies were actually making things worse instead of better. And what often happens again is the person is applying the same attentive solution over and over again in a relationship, for example, and it's still not working. And it's probably making the problem worse. So I think that when I was supervising clinical students, I would tell them, okay, so look for the way you need to understand very clearly how the client has been attempting to resolve the problems the client is coming in with. And what you're going to find 9 times out of 10 is that the client's attempted solutions are part of what is making the problem worse over time. And if nothing else, get them to stop doing that, and the problem will get better.
Yeah. I think I heard there's a quote that goes something like you'll probably know it, but something like the problem isn't the problem. The proposed solution to the problem is the problem.
I think that's good. Yeah, I think that pertains here, and not just the proposed solution, but the solution itself, when implemented, is making things worse. And it's so hard for any of us to understand the ways in which our behavior is affecting other people. But that's what a good therapist does, is helps the client understand how the client is contributing to the problems that the client is expecting the therapist to fix.
Yeah.
Again, going back to what a good cognitive behavioral therapist does.
Yeah. You know, I actually thought this conversation was going to be very abstract. But, you know, if I like summarize, you know, all the practical utility, all the little gemstones that have been scattered throughout this conversation, I'm hearing a lot that someone can do. I'm hearing that, you know, go to draw.io, think about your patterns of feeling, thinking, behaving, your attentional patterns, and then think about the broader systems that you're in, family, neighborhoods, cultural norms. I'm hearing once you do that, to understand the system at an even deeper level, try to shift it. That'll give you clues about what, you know, or what links are there. I'm hearing keep your head down and track what happens. So in terms of like, how is this behavior working for me? So always be asking yourself, how is this working? What's the result here? And then I'm hearing experiment. Don't just try to theoretically cohere before you behave. I just that already feels so dense.
I think that's a very good summary of the practical value of some of these abstract ideas. In fact, there was a psychologist years and years and years ago. I think it was Kurt Levine, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany, who became what he's considered the father of social psychology, at least in the United States. And he was giving a talk somewhere, and someone said, that's just a theory. And his response was, there's nothing quite so practical as a good theory. I think that applies here.
Oh, yeah, that's a beautiful quote.
If it doesn't have practical value, then it's probably not a very good theory.
Okay, great. I want to check in, before we end for today, just in terms of the summary I've thrown back at you, in terms of if someone was deciding how to help themselves, and they were like, okay, I'm gonna, try to understand myself now, increase my self-awareness, and try to help my own suffering in some way. And they went following, the sort of summary that I've outlined. Is there anything else that you would add to that, or any ribbon you'd sort of put on all of this?
I think a person needs to continually ask themselves, what am I trying to accomplish? Not just what am I trying to accomplish in life, but in this particular situation, in this interaction with this person or these people, what am I trying to accomplish? What do I want to get out of this? And then ask yourself, how well is my behavior helping me or hindering me from accomplishing what I want to accomplish? If, for example, my goal is to get a better, more satisfying, higher paying job, but I'm too anxious of job interviews to schedule them, or once scheduled, I canceled them. I need to ask myself, how is this particular behavior helping me or hindering me from accomplishing the goal of getting a better, more satisfying, higher paying job? And what do I need to do in order to try to fix that, including how do I need to behave differently in a job interview to make it a more successful job interview? What do I need to do in preparation for the job interview to increase the chances that the job interview will go well, including doing maybe some meditation, some deep breathing. If I find myself getting anxious, I say to myself in the interview, well, this is just to be expected. This is not a tragedy. So those kinds of things. What I did, for example, preparing for this podcast, is I reread. I could have come in cold and would have found myself probably floundering for ideas that are back there deep in my brain. But I reread some articles that I had read years ago, and some new articles, and reread something I had actually written several years ago, and made a list and made a bunch of notes and things, and it helped me get ready. It made these ideas like right in the front of my cortex. So there was some preparation involved. Life requires preparation. Woody Allen once said that 80% of life is just showing up. I think it's better to say 80% of life is showing up prepared. And the preparation is sometimes people don't want to take the time for, including preparing yourself for a job interview, or preparing yourself for what's going to be a difficult conversation with a partner or a friend or a family member. And part of the preparation, okay, what do I want to accomplish in this conversation with this person about this issue? And what do I need to say? What can I say? If this person says this, how can I respond? So there's some rehearsing involved in life. Often preparation is rehearsing a conversation and anticipating what might happen and how you might respond to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that is a great note to end on. I'm thinking in terms of the preparedness. I'm thinking, Alexa, you're so prepared to call your mom as well, putting in that reminder with Alexa. So you're definitely walking the talk here, preparing for the podcast.
She has a medical appointment at 2, and she's 90, so she always forgets. She'll say, well, I thought that was tomorrow. No, it's today. It's at 2:00. So I need to call her at time, because otherwise she'll just forget and won't be ready in time. So preparation.
Yeah. Good thing she's got a prepared son. Yeah.
Oh, good thing I've got Alexa too.
Yeah. Great.
Remind me, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your generosity, not just with your time, but also your just the tone of generosity in the work you do, and the the impact that that can have, sharing these ideas and
Thank you.
caring about people's well-being.
This is fun. This is a lot of fun for me. So I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, great. So I think I'll definitely have you on again. I know you did send me other topic ideas, so I'll be in
I'd
contact
love
and
to.
we can set something up soon.
Great.
Okay.
All right.
Right.